Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History Episodes. Tonight, we are not standing on battlefields, nor wandering cathedral aisles beneath stained glass. We are stepping into smaller rooms where desire was whispered, where love was bargained, and where the body, in all its clumsy honesty, was watched by walls much too close. This is not the history of kings on thrones, but of ordinary beds creaking in the dark. You might picture it as romance, candles flickering golden against stone, sheets of velvet, soft as a dream, a lute playing somewhere in the courtyard, its melody floating up to a chamber where lovers wait. But push the tapestry aside, and the picture is not so polished. The floor is packed earth. A chicken shifts in the corner, settling noisily into straw. Children snore 3 feet away, their legs tangled in the same blanket. Even in noble houses, the scene was rarely private. A maid lingers by the door, pretending to sleep on a stool. Another servant moves through the shadows, tending the fire that is always too small. Desire here is not wrapped in silk, but squeezed between noise and duty. Romance in the Middle Ages was never quite what the poems promised. If drifting through these stranger, quieter truths of medieval life feels like the kind of company you want tonight, you're welcome to like or subscribe, only if it eases your evening, only if it helps you settle, and if you'd like, share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's oddly comforting to imagine this quiet circle of listeners, scattered across the world, linked not by candlelight, but by the soft glow of story. So let yourself sink into it. Dim your lights. Let the hum of a fan become the hush of a medieval hall. Smell the faint drift of smoke from straw, the mix of sweat and incense, the closeness of too many bodies in one small space. Let your breath fall slower, as though the night itself has draped a cloak across your shoulders. And when humor appears, a crooked smile at the absurdities of the past, it will not break the spell. It will only lighten it, like a small fire glowing in the corner, not large enough to consume, only enough to warm. You make it happen. Chapter 1. Shared rooms, shared lives. Where could it happen? That was the first obstacle. Not desire itself, not even the rules of the church, but the simple fact of space. Most medieval homes were a single room, one fire, one table, one bed. The animals slept in the same air, their warmth considered useful, their noise accepted like weather. Children, parents, grandparents, all curled together like knots in a rope. Imagine lying down beside your spouse, the day's dirt still clinging to your skin. You turn your body toward them, but only a few feet away your youngest coughs in their sleep. Your mother-in-law sighs heavily as she shifts on her straw mattress. Even if you manage to ignore them, the goats in the corner stamp their hooves, reminding you they too are present witnesses. Privacy was rare, and so intimacy became a kind of negotiation. A couple might wait until the children finally drifted, the fire died low, and the village outside quieted. They would whisper, shift carefully, pretend the walls of the room were thicker than they were. For peasants, the solution was sometimes practical. A blanket pulled over heads, a body turned toward the wall. What one scholar calls the medieval volume control. In other words, do what you must, just keep it quiet. In larger towns, inns offered no relief. Travelers shared beds with strangers, their names recorded side by side in the innkeeper's book. A husband and wife on a journey might find themselves climbing into a mattress, already occupied by 2 or 3 others. A candle stub flickers, feet brush in the dark, and somewhere a stranger mutters, "Move over." In that setting, romance was less moonlight and more choreography. If you wanted privacy, you had to purchase the whole bed. Few could afford that luxury, so you waited or you risked embarrassment. One chronicler even warned travelers to check their bed for unfamiliar occupants before attempting marital affection. It was sound advice. And what of the nobility? Did wealth buy silence? Not always. A noble chamber was larger, yes, hung with tapestries, firm husband and wife, whose vigorous conduct kept half the street awake. The council fined them, not for the act, but for disturbing the peace. To us, such arrangements might seem impossible, but to them, it was ordinary. The body had to find its place in the same crowded rooms where soup simmered, where tools hung from rafters, where chickens roosted. Love was not lifted out of daily life, it was tangled inside it. You smell it first. Smoke from damp firewood, wool that had never seen soap, straw trampled by hooves. Then add the perfume of closeness, breath against breath, skin against linen that was rarely washed. Desire survived there, not in spite of the mess, but within it. And humour was inevitable, a whispered laugh when the child rolled over, when a goat bleated at the wrong moment, when a servant coughed a little too obviously. Couples developed codes, phrases to signal, jokes to ease the tension. Turn to the wall, one might mutter, or pretend you sleep. Romance became choreography, half sincere, half concealed. The heart raced, but the face stayed calm. The sound stayed low. And always, above it all, the sound of bells. The church bell rang out the hours, reminding every ear that the calendar was as powerful as the body. For even if you found a place, there remained the question of time. When was it permitted? When was it forbidden? The answer, as we shall see, lay not in the bedroom, but in the church. Chapter 2. The church calendar and forbidden days. If space was the first obstacle, time was the second. And in the Middle Ages, time did not belong to couples. It belonged to the church. The bell tower ruled the day, and the calendar ruled the night. Not every day was fit for love. Not every night permitted. Desire had to bend to a schedule written in sermons and in ink. The rules were strict. Sundays? Forbidden. Fridays? Also forbidden. Too close to the memory of Christ's passion. Advent? Off limits. Lent? Off limits. Major feast days? Off limits again. By the time the lists were done, nearly half the year was declared unsuitable. A married couple might lie side by side for weeks, touching only by accident, counting days like prisoners waiting for release. One medieval penitential manual listed so many forbidden times that a jester joked the only safe night left was a Tuesday in April, if the moon was kind. The logic was simple, at least to the church. Passion was dangerous. Too much of it distracted from prayer. It tempted people toward excess, toward lust, toward forgetting their souls. So priests stood watch, not just in the pulpit, but in the bedroom by proxy, turning the marriage bed into another place of discipline. To love too often was not joy, but sin. To enjoy it too much was even worse. A sober, measured union, that was acceptable. But anything that strayed into heat or laughter belonged to confession. The rules fell harder on the noble. Courtiers were visible, their households full of watchful servants, their confessions monitored. A duke or duchess might be reminded by their chaplain that they were dangerously close to Advent, and that even within marriage, desire must be set aside. Among peasants, the calendar was more flexible. Yes, they listened to sermons. Yes, they knew the rules. But the priest was far away, and life was short. when your roof leaked, when your harvest was uncertain.
Friday. Perhaps dawn was early enough to be Saturday. Desire made its own theology, inventing excuses in the shadows. And sometimes, the restrictions themselves sparked invention. If one could not join in bed, then there were stolen kisses in doorways, hurried touches in kitchens, long looks across fields. The body learned patience, and patience made desire sharper. But humor clung to it too. One chronicler teased that husbands became holy men only because the church left them no other option. Another laughed that wives, when told it was forbidden, would mutter, "Then let us sin together and confess together." The human heart bent, but it never broke, not even under the weight of half a year of silence. Picture the sound of bells again. A husband and wife stir from sleep. The bed is crowded, the fire low. They glance at each other. The moment could be theirs, but then the bells toll. One glance is enough. They sigh, turn away, wait for another night. And if the bells had not tolled, perhaps history would look different. Perhaps love would have claimed more ground than the church allowed. So, when desire could not fit into the calendar, people found another way. If the question was not when, then it became how. Because when nights were forbidden and days were restricted, the body still searched for its own language. And that language, as we'll see, was shaped into rules of posture, of gesture, of position itself. From the safest form of union to the suspicion cast on anything more, intimacy was choreographed as carefully as a church procession. That is where we turn next. From the calendar's grip on time to the body's obedience in form. Chapter 3. Positions and moral codes. If time was restricted, the body was even more so. Because intimacy in the Middle Ages was not only a private act, it was a moral act. Every gesture, every position was weighed on scales of sin and virtue. The church did not only tell couples when, it told them how. The missionary position, as we call it today, was considered the safest, the most natural, the least offensive to heaven. A man above, a woman below, both facing each other. It mirrored the order of the world. Man as leader, woman as vessel, union as duty. Anything that strayed beyond that invited suspicion. Manuals for confessors, those strange guides priests used to question the faithful, listed variations with disapproval. Too much movement, too much pleasure, too much invention, all could be classed as sin. One priest wrote that coupling should be quick, restrained, without joy, as though love itself were a kind of medicine to be swallowed with a grimace. Laughter was forbidden. Experimentation was condemned. To seek pleasure for its own sake was to risk the fires of hell. And yet, people were people. Not every couple moved like statues. Not every kiss was a duty. In villages, among peasants, the rules blurred. Desire found its own shapes in haylofts, in barns, in corners of crowded rooms. But the anxiety lingered. Step into the scene of two lovers, turning to one another in the dark. Their lips meet, their hands search for closeness. Yet behind every touch lingers the priest's warning. This way is acceptable, that way is sinful. The body hesitates not because of shame alone, but because the weight of eternity presses down on the bed. Writers sometimes mocked the rigidity. A satirist joked that the church's list of forbidden positions was longer than the Psalms. Another quipped that, if every variation was sinful, then even angels must be lonely. But jokes could not erase the seriousness. Confession booths heard whispers of guilt. Imagine the scene. A husband awkwardly quoting a priest's advice, his wife rolling her eyes, both stifling a giggle while trying to stay respectable, or the whispered joke that the safest position of all was, "Not tonight, dear." Even under the weight of rules, humour slipped in. It always does. Still, the codes mattered. They shaped how people saw themselves and how they judged one another. A woman rumoured to be too lively in bed could be accused of sin, even witchcraft. A man too indulgent might be warned his vigour was wasting his soul. Pleasure was not a private question. It was moral, social, eternal. And so, the bed was never just a bed. It was a stage where heaven and hell watched as closely as the person beside you. The church wanted union to be like prayer, measured, humble, restrained. And often couples complied. But beneath the silence, beneath the duty, the truth of human bodies still flickered. A candle burning low, a room crowded with breath, two figures moving carefully, as though any misstep might summon judgment. And when the act ended, it was not poetry, not passion, but silence, and sometimes a quick sign of the cross. Such was intimacy, caught between flesh and faith. But the bed was never only bodies. It was bargains too. Parchments signed, dowries weighed, fields divided. Before two could touch in private, their futures had already been traded in public. Chapter 4. Marriage as Contract. For all the whispers about sin, for all the warnings about how and when, none of it mattered until one thing was settled first: the contract. Marriage in the Middle Ages was rarely about love. It was about land, inheritance, alliances. It was about keeping cows where they belonged and making sure a family's fields did not vanish into someone else's hands. Imagine a father, his daughter sitting quietly beside him. He speaks with another man across the table. They bargain not about affection, but about acres, dowries, debts. How many sheep? How much grain each harvest? What portion of land will pass to grandchildren? The daughter's voice matters little. Her beauty might help the price. Her virtue might seal the deal. But the numbers rule the room. For peasants, the same pattern unfolded, though on a smaller scale. Instead of manors and estates, it was a pig, a small patch of barley, a wooden plough. A girl's hand could be promised in exchange for a few tools, a bit of cloth, or the relief of one family's debt. It sounds harsh, but survival was always the first priority. And in a world where fields dictated hunger or plenty, marriage was agriculture disguised as romance. Even among nobles, the ceremony was less about poetry and more about paperwork. Priests blessed the union, yes, but the real binding came from documents, sealed contracts, signed witnesses. Marriage was law before it was love. Some customs skipped even the priest. In parts of England and Scotland, a couple might clasp hands before witnesses, a ritual called hand fasting. It was enough to count as binding. Later, they might add a church blessing, but the promise itself was made with palm against palm. Two lives tied by word as much as by heart. For women, marriage was both doorway and cage. It could lift them into higher households, but it also bound them firmly within them. A wife's duty was clear: obedience, fertility, household work. Her dowry passed to her husband. Her body became part of the bargain. Cows, 2 pigs, a house with a roof that does not leak. Love was not mentioned once.
Imagine standing before your peers, your worth tallied like grain sacks. It was embarrassing but practical, because in the end, bread filled bellies, not poems. And yet love slipped in through the cracks. A couple might begin as strangers, bartered into union, but over years, through children, through shared winters, they sometimes grew close. The contract was written in ink, but affection could still write itself slowly in flesh. Still, the contract carried weight heavier than affection. For noble houses, the future of dynasties hung on it. For peasants, survival of fields depended on it. And for women, reputation was fastened tightest of all. Because after the contract was signed, after the feast, after the prayers, there came the test. The ink proved the land was exchanged, but what proved the bride herself? The answer lay in virginity, the most fragile clause of all. And so, while husbands and wives were bound by parchment and promises, it was often the bedsheet that became the truest proof.
Chapter 5. Virginity and Proof. The contract may have been signed, the feast may have been eaten, the families may have shaken hands, but none of it was considered complete until one more question was answered. Was the bride untouched? For noble families, this question carried more than curiosity. It carried property rights, inheritance, and the fragile balance of alliances. If a young woman's virtue was doubted, the marriage could be annulled, the dowry clawed back, the alliance shattered. And so virginity became not just private, but political. It was a guarantee of paternity, a seal on the contract, a promise that future children truly belonged to the husband's line. The methods of proof were clumsy at best, cruel at worst. Sometimes it was no more than reputation. She is modest, neighbors might say. She avoids men at market. Other times it was invasive. Matrons or midwives might be called to inspect, searching for the mythical hymen, believed to be a mark of untouched flesh. Science has long since shown that such proofs were unreliable, but in the Middle Ages, perception mattered more than biology. Then there was the bedsheet. On the wedding night, newlyweds were expected to consummate their union, and in some places the linen sheets were inspected in the morning. A stain of blood was displayed as evidence of virginity. A grim and awkward ritual turned into public theatre. Neighbors whispered. Families waited. If the sheet stayed clean, there could be lawsuits, accusations, even annulments. Envision the weight pressing down on a young bride in that bed. Her future and her family's honor balanced on a single, fragile stain of red. For peasants, the rules were softer, but still sharp. A young woman found not to be chaste before marriage might face fines, public penance, or a hurried wedding arranged overnight. Sometimes the couple was pushed together by gossip. If a pregnancy had already begun, the marriage came quickly. Papers signed before bellies showed. In such cases, virginity was less about morality and more. Virginity mattered, but it was also negotiated, ignored, or patched over with silence. Humor, too, slipped in. One satirical poem mocked the ritual, imagining neighbors lined up to review the wedding sheet as though it were a market stall. Another chronicler joked that some families kept a bottle of animal blood handy, just in case the proof was lacking. Grim laughter, but laughter nonetheless. A reminder that even in heavy matters, people found ways to shrug at the absurdity. So, virginity in the medieval world was not simply about innocence. It was a form of currency, a line in a contract, a fragile cloth stretched between two families. For some brides it was a prison, for others a shield. For many, a stage they never wished to stand on. And when that stage felt too confining, some couples stepped off it entirely. They tested their bond before marriage, knowing the risks, accepting the fines, or simply hiding it from the eyes of priests and neighbors. Because when contracts and proofs grew too heavy, desire still searched for a way out. And that way out was often found before the bells ever rang.
Chapter 6. Before the wedding bell, fornication and fines. If virginity was guarded so fiercely, you might wonder, did people truly wait? The answer, of course, is that human nature was not so patient. Couples stole moments. They whispered behind barns, walked too long by the village well, slipped out into the fields at dusk. And sometimes they went further. The church had a name for it: fornication, a word heavy with judgment. But in practice, it simply meant desire jumping ahead of the schedule. Communities noticed. Walls were thin, eyes were sharp, and tongues were sharper still. If a couple was suspected, it rarely stayed secret. Neighbors talked, priests heard, and soon their names were inked into parish records, a quiet but permanent mark. The consequences came quickly. For first offences, there might be fines, coins handed over, a reminder that morality had a price. If a pregnancy resulted, the penalty grew heavier. Sometimes the man was pressed to marry the woman at once. Sometimes the families negotiated, dowries adjusted, timelines shortened, and in many cases, a wedding erased the sin. Retroactive permission, signed with vows at the altar, but not always. Some communities insisted that even a married couple pay for what had already passed. Early affection came with what one historian called the early bird penalty. Cheaper than disgrace perhaps, but still a sting. There were public punishments too. A pair might be ordered to stand before the church doors, barefoot and penitent, as neighbors filed past to watch. Others were told to walk through the village square, hands joined, heads lowered, to show they had broken rules but chosen to mend them. And yet, for all the shame, for all the scribes scratching notes in ledgers, people kept testing the lines. Because marriage was often arranged, more contract than courtship, young men and women wanted to know, could they truly live together? Would this bond hold? In some regions, handfasting filled the gap. A promise made in private, sometimes with clasped hands, sometimes with whispered vows. The church frowned, but for the couple, it felt binding enough. And the council disagreed. But the sentiment lingers, the small spark of defiance against the weight of law. For the poor, fines were especially harsh. A coin could mean bread for a week. So families bargained, offered goods instead. A goat, a sack of grain, a bundle of wool. In the ledgers of medieval towns, desire is measured not in kisses, but in livestock. Still, life moved on. Many of those fined couples went on to live ordinary lives, raising children, working fields, sitting side by side in church as though nothing had happened. The memory of their crime faded into the rhythm of village life. What lasted longer was the gossip, passed down in whispers, retold as cautionary tales, laughed about by grandchildren who only half believed the story. So before the bells, before the feast, before the white sheets of proof, there was this shadowland, half approved, half condemned. It was a space of risk, but also of freedom, a place where love tried to bloom before duty caught it. And when vows did not follow, when secret bonds strayed beyond what was permitted, the word changed. No longer fornication, now it was adultery. And the consequences, for women especially, were far sharper. Chapter 7. Adultery and consequences. If secret love before marriage could be pardoned, adultery after marriage was another matter. Here the rules grew sharper, the punishments harsher, and the double standards more visible than ever. For women, the risks were heavy.
A wife who strayed from her husband's bed could lose more than honor. She could lose her dowry, her children, her place in society itself. Noble families guarded their bloodlines closely. If a woman was accused of bearing another man's child, the scandal threatened inheritance, alliances, even dynasties. So suspicion alone could ruin her. There were rituals of proof. Sometimes a servant was sent to watch a mistress more closely. Sometimes neighbors were asked to testify about who entered her chambers and at what hour. And sometimes the evidence was simply her belly, swelling at the wrong time, casting doubt that never quite lifted. Punishments varied. A noblewoman might be sent away to a convent, her wealth stripped, her children denied to her. A peasant wife could be cast out of her home, left to beg or return in shame to her father's house. And yet men's affairs were often treated differently. A husband who kept a mistress might be frowned upon, but rarely punished. Unless, of course, his mistress threatened another man's honor. Then the outrage came fast. Stories survive of inventive penalties. In one German town, a woman accused of adultery was paraded through the streets, wearing only her shift, while the townsfolk jeered. In France, a husband might force his wife to walk barefoot, carrying a candle to the church altar, a living confession on display. And in England, a man sometimes chose personal vengeance over public shame. Records mention wives beaten, wives locked away, wives who simply vanished. The written laws were harsh, but often the harsher law was that of the husband himself. Yet the double standard was plain. A man's affair might even be tolerated, especially if it was discreet and if his wife kept her silence. Some wives did so, weighing their dignity against their survival. Others endured quietly, finding whispers, ignoring sermons. A village woman might find comfort in a neighbor's arms, while her husband drank himself to sleep. The church thundered, the laws punished, but the heart was stubborn. And not all stories ended in ruin. There were cases of forgiveness. A husband, moved by pity, welcomed his wife back after her penance. A wife, wounded but resigned, chose to accept her husband's mistress as part of life's burden. But these were exceptions. More often, adultery left a scar, a mark on a woman's name, a whisper that followed her children, a shadow across a family's standing. The atmosphere of a medieval village. A rumor breaks like wind across a field. By nightfall, everyone knows who lingered too long in the barn, whose footsteps were seen near the mill after dusk. Gossip was its own punishment, a constant trial by tongue. And so desire, when it strayed, risked becoming not only a sin, but a spectacle. It was a paradox. Society demanded purity, yet built structures that almost invited transgression. Marriage was often a contract, not a romance. Husbands and wives were strangers joined for land and cattle. And where love was absent, the search for it began elsewhere. But society also offered outlets. If adultery was too dangerous, there were other doors to step through. In the heart of towns, behind permitted walls, a different kind of arrangement waited. Watched, taxed, and regulated. It was not love, it was business, and it was tolerated more than passion ever was.
Chapter 8. Brothels and Public Regulation.
If adultery risked shame and ruin, there was another path, one society pretended to despise, yet quietly built into its very streets. The brothel. At first glance it seems strange. The church thundered against lust. Priests warned of eternal fire.
And yet in the middle of town stood houses where lust was not only allowed, but regulated, licensed, taxed. Medieval people were practical. They knew desire would not disappear simply because bishops declared it sinful. So towns carved out spaces for it, as one might carve a drain in the street to channel the flow. In Paris, records describe entire districts set aside for such houses. In London, banks of the Thames held buildings with painted doors, welcoming men from every walk of life. In German towns, officials appointed a keeper of public women, a man tasked with organizing, supervising, and of course, collecting fees. It was bureaucracy wrapped around intimacy, the city transforming desire into revenue. The rules were surprisingly detailed. A brothel might be open only during daylight hours, so men could not slip away under cover of night. The bedding had to be aired out regularly, a gesture more symbolic than effective. The women were forbidden to wear fine clothes, to keep them visually distinct from honest wives. And taxes were collected, coin by coin, feeding town treasuries. In some places, the profits were even shared with the church. A contradiction, but one no one lingered on too loudly. The clientele was varied. Apprentices, labourers, students, all too young or too poor to marry. Merchants in from the countryside, spending coin before returning home. Even noblemen, slipping in with cloaks drawn low, pretending anonymity was possible. Brothels became not only places of flesh, but of gossip. News passed quickly in such spaces, from a servant's whisper to a merchant's confession. They were, in their way, information hubs. They were not without danger. Moralists condemned them. Diseases spread silently. Violence sometimes flared. The women themselves lived on the margins, tolerated but rarely respected. They were needed but never honored.
Were a paradox. They denounced them from the pulpit, yet many towns maintained them in cooperation with local bishops. The idea was simple. Better men sin in one place, contained and managed, than spread their sins everywhere. It was, perhaps, a kind of damage control. But for women, the cost was real. Most entered the trade out of poverty. Some were abandoned wives, others orphans with no dowry, others sold outright by desperate families. The brothel offered food, shelter, and a small wage, but it also carried stigma that clung for life. If she tried to leave, a woman might find no one willing to marry her, no honest work open to her. The brothel doors swung inward easily, but outward rarely. Still, society accepted them. On feast days, men might go straight from church to such houses, as casually as one might stop at a tavern. Officials complained, but not too loudly. Coin kept moving, and the streets stayed quieter for it. Think of the contradiction. A priest might thunder against adultery in the morning, yet the same afternoon, the city council collected its tax from a brothel just across the square. Morality and pragmatism shared the same street, nodding at each other, pretending not to notice. It was not love, not romance, not the verses of courtly poets, but it was part of life, a structure built as deliberately as the market hall or the church tower. Desire contained, money counted, and silence maintained. And yet, not everyone wanted to risk such places. For those who feared shame, who feared the ledger, who feared the priest's scowl, there were other methods, other tricks whispered in kitchens, handed down from midwives, from widows, from women who knew the body's secrets. Strange recipes, herbs and charms, half medicine, half hope. They offered something different, not indulgence,
but prevention. From painted doors and licensed rooms, desire slipped back into kitchens. Whispers carried in cupboards, recipes folded into silence. Here, people searched. Chapter 9. Contraception and Folk Remedies. Desire rarely asked permission, and when it came, no bell, no priest, no city law could hold it back. But in a world where children meant mouths to feed, and inheritance meant land divided too thin, some couples sought ways to shape their fate. They reached not for parchment laws, but for herbs, charms, and whispers passed from hand to hand. The methods were many, and most sound strange to us now. One involved cloth, a thin scrap soaked in vinegar or wine, placed before the act, as if sharpness of taste might also sting away seed. Others trusted honey or wax. Midwives suggested beeswax melted and shaped, forming a soft barrier. It sounded clever, but in practice it was clumsy, and often more hope than help. Still, couples tried. When survival depended on it, hope was a form of medicine. Then came the herbs. Rue, pennyroyal, savin, plants with reputations fierce enough to curl the tongue. Boiled into teas, pressed into tinctures, they were said to warm the womb, a coded phrase meaning they might flush it out. The problem, of course, was dosage. Too little, nothing changed. Too much, and the woman herself sickened, sometimes fatally. And so knowledge passed carefully, from midwife to apprentice, from grandmother to granddaughter, spoken low, never written in the parish book, but kept alive all the same. Superstition played its part. One charm advised tying a small bone from a black cat around the waist. Another suggested hopping backwards 3 times after the act, a trick more comic than useful. A student in Paris joked that if such methods worked, then the city would be filled with couples leaping like frogs in alleyways. The humor masked anxiety, but the image lingered. Men, too, had their roles. Some carried amulets, tiny lead tablets etched with prayers to saints, never recognized by Rome. Others drank potions meant to cool their seed. Most failed, but the attempt itself shows how deep the need ran. The church condemned it all in the gesture, but there is also resolve. The body sought its own agency, even in a world that tried to deny it. And sometimes the advice was simply comical. One recipe claimed that a woman should drink wine boiled with the ashes of a burnt weasel. Another suggested placing half an onion against the thigh. The smell alone might have discouraged any suitor, so perhaps in that sense it worked. We laugh now, but the desperation was real. Children could be blessings, yes, but they were also labor, burdens, mouths that might starve in a bad harvest. Contraception, however clumsy, was survival strategy as much as anything. And what of those who could not or would not rely on such measures? They turned back to the brothel, to confession, to the fatalism of God wills what he wills. But for the many who tried, who drank bitter teas, who tied bones with string, who leapt in alleys by moonlight, they reveal a truth too often forgotten, that medieval people were not passive. They experimented, they resisted, they sought control, even in small, fragile ways. The herbs, the charms, the backward hops under the moon. They were never certainty, only gestures of hope, a handful of leaves, a scrap of cloth, a whispered recipe in the dark, all fragile, all fading quickly. The herbs lost their power, the charms faded like smoke, but the smells remained. Smoke,
Sweat, straw, wool, intimacy breathed inside that heavy air. And that air is where the story turns next. Chapter 10. Hygiene, smells, and daily reality. Desire in the Middle Ages did not arrive in perfumed chambers. It arrived in air thick with smoke, with sweat, with the weight of daily life clinging to skin and cloth. Bathing was rare. Water itself was suspect. Many believed hot baths opened the pores, inviting sickness inside. Physicians warned against it. Priests discouraged it. And so most households treated a full bath as something occasional, almost ceremonial. A peasant might wash hands and face, but the rest of the body, left to linen shifts, changed when possible, aired out by the fire. The wealthy could afford tubs, but even then the water was shared. Husband, wife, children, sometimes even guests, all took turns in the same barrel. The unlucky last found themselves soaking not in fresh water, but in the residue of everyone before them. A medieval spa day was rarely refreshing. Soap existed, but it was costly. Made of tallow and ash, sometimes perfumed with herbs, it was more a tool of the wealthy. For many, cleaning meant scraping skin with cloth, rubbing down with sand or flour, or simply changing into the least soiled garment at hand. And then came the clothes. Wool cloaks never washed, only brushed and aired. Linen shirts wore day and night, absorbing sweat until they grew stiff. In noble halls, layers upon layers. Silks and furs, sometimes dyed with minerals so harsh they irritated the skin beneath. The smell was constant. Not a single odor, but a mixture. Smoke from damp firewood, garlic and onions from supper, leather hardened with sweat, and the sourness of straw pressed under too many bodies. Couples grew used to it. In fact, they became nose-blind. When everyone carried the same musk, it faded into the background. But visitors noticed. One Italian traveller remarked that English halls smelled of wet dog and ale. Another noted that French nobles masked themselves in perfume so strong it was almost suffocating. It was less about covering the scent and more about overpowering it. Small tricks helped. The wealthy carried gloves scented with lavender. Knights kept pomanders, tiny balls filled with of a bride so perfumed with musk on her wedding night that her groom fainted at the first kiss. Perfume was protection, but sometimes it became its own hazard. The church tried, occasionally, to encourage bathing before holy days. Some towns had public bathhouses, but they were quickly suspected of doubling as places of sin. The line between hygiene and pleasure blurred easily. So many families returned to the safer path. Little water, much linen, and acceptance. A narrow chamber, a single hearth. Your children snore. A goat shifts straw in the corner. Your spouse turns toward you, their skin warm, their breath heavy. This was intimacy. Not despite the smells, but inside them. The odors were part of life, woven into memory, impossible to separate. And in that closeness, a strange truth emerges. Love did not need perfumes to survive. It survived through habit, through touch, through laughter shared even in the heaviest air. Romance in the medieval world was not clean, but it was real. The smells remain with us now, in chronicles, in jokes, in the margins of old sermons. They remind us that passion was always human first, ritual second. But not every kind of love fit into the patterns preached from the pulpit. Not every bond was husband and wife. Not every affection was permitted. In hidden corners, in poems passed quietly, in letters exchanged under cloaks, another kind of intimacy lived, forbidden yet enduring. Chapter 11. Same-sex love and coded affections. Not every bond of affection fit the mold the church demanded. Desire was meant to move in straight lines. husband to wife, wife to husband. Anything else was marked as sin, named as disorder, treated as danger. And yet, in quiet corners, other kinds of closeness endured. The monasteries were full of them. Men living together, eating together, praying together, sleeping in cells that echoed with whispers at night. Friendship there often deepened into something more. A tenderness that had no safe name, but found its expression in letters and poems. Some monks wrote verses to companions they called beloved, their words glowing with intimacy. Others exchanged small gifts, tokens of affection that might pass for brotherhood, but carried a weight deeper than duty. For women, the convent was its own world. Nuns lived side by side, sharing vows, sharing labor, sometimes sharing hearts. In their letters you find phrases like, "Without your voice I am silent," or "I long to sit with you in the garden, for no psalm is sweeter than your presence." The church read such lines as spiritual allegory. Perhaps sometimes they were, but perhaps not always. Among the nobility there were poems written in code. Courtly verse often spoke of the beloved, without naming man or woman. This ambiguity gave space. A knight could compose lines to another knight, cloaked in the safety of allegory. A lady might write to her companion, her words sliding between devotion and desire. Only the reader knew which truth was meant. But always there was risk. Punishments varied, from fines to exile to worse, and so secrecy became its own art. Metaphor did the work words could not. A rose might stand for a body. A lamp might stand for a soul's flame. Even the simplest exchange, a touch of the hand, a glance held too long, had to live in shadow. Still, these affections survived. We know because they appear in records, not as open declarations, but as accusations. A town chronicle in 15th century Germany notes, "Joyful, sometimes punished." There is no need for mockery here, only the reminder that human hearts rarely fit neatly into the shapes society demands. Even in the Middle Ages, an age we picture as rigid, harsh, bound in rules, affections still found their paths, through poems, through songs, through glances and touches that history barely recorded. And perhaps that is fitting. Some loves leave no monuments, no treaties, no portraits, but they live on in fragments, in whispers across time. Two figures walking in silence, hands almost touching, eyes saying what lips cannot. The air heavy with risk, but also with the ache of something real. It is fragile, but it is not nothing. It is love, hidden, surviving. And from here the question rises. If so much was forbidden, if so much was controlled, then what was left? Did love itself, in all its ordinary, clumsy, human ways, truly exist in this age? Or was it always contract, obligation, sin, or secrecy? That is the question that leads us now. Not to rules, not to punishments, not to codes of silence, but to the fragile possibility of love itself. Chapter 12. Love, if it existed. So after all the rules, all the contracts, all the whispered prohibitions, what remains? Did love exist in the Middle Ages? Not the love of troubadours and poets, not the allegories painted in stained glass, but the kind of love you and I would recognize. Messy, ordinary, soft in its persistence. The answer is yes. It existed, but it rarely appeared in chronicles. Wars, treaties, inheritances, those filled the parchment. But love, quiet and private, lived in letters, in small gestures, in the places where history forgot to look. A merchant's wife in Norwich wrote to her husband while he was away. Her words simple. "I miss you, and I pray each night for your return. for the bed feels cold without you. Nothing grand, nothing poetic, but a truth that carried across distance. In rural France, a court record describes a couple who ran away together, leaving dowries and contracts behind. Neighbors called it foolish. The priest called it sin. But they called it love, and for them, that was enough. Among peasants, love sometimes appeared in laughter. A man and woman working side by side in the fields, their hands brushing in the furrows. An evening dance in the village square, feet stamping in rhythm, eyes catching between turns. There were no gilded halls here, no troubadours singing. But affection grew all the same, woven into daily toil. Even among nobles, where duty outweighed desire, love sometimes broke through. Chroniclers tell of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who played politics with brilliance, but also adored her troubadours, men whose songs blurred politics and passion. Or of Charles d'Orléans, who wrote verses from his prison cell, poems of longing that were less about power and more about missing the touch of familiar hands. These were not common stories, but they remind us that love is stubborn. It refuses to vanish, even when rules close in. What love looked like then was often awkward. It was laughter stolen in kitchens, comfort found during sickness, shared bread in years of famine.
Young couple, wed not by choice, but by contract. At first they are strangers, but over seasons their laughter grows easier, their silences more comfortable. And one night, without thinking, one reaches for the other's hand. Not obligation, not duty, just love. So did it exist? Yes, though rarely written, though often hidden, though sometimes condemned. It existed in the rustle of straw beds, in the faint notes of a lute carried on wind, in the warmth of bodies pressed close against winter's cold. It existed not as grand romance, but as endurance, as choice, as the softest rebellion against a world that tried to make intimacy only duty. And as we close, that is the note worth holding, that even in an age of contracts, of forbidden days, of laws that reached into bedrooms, people still found ways to care, to cherish, to belong to each other. The torches gutter, the bells are silent. Only the breath of sleepers remains. The Middle Ages have faded back into shadow, but the tenderness lingers. Not gilded, not polished, only human. Now the murmur fades, the shutters close, the courtyard lies still beneath the night. What remains is not the fines, not the sermons, not the lists of forbidden days. What remains are the softer traces, a hand reaching under rough wool, a glance caught across a crowded hall, a laugh hidden under straw. The chronicles did not dwell on these things. They filled their pages with kings and battles, but in the margins, a rumour, a fine, a song too tender to name, you find proof that love survived, awkward, quiet, but alive. The rules tried to bind it, the church tried to measure it, neighbours tried to judge it, and yet hearts went on, finding their own hours, their own places, their own language in the dark. Think of a moment like this. A woman folds a letter twice, slips it under a chest. A man carves initials in the beam above their bed. A couple sits together by the fire, their silence easier than words. This is the love the records forgot. Not gilded, not celebrated, but stubborn enough to endure. So let the story settle. Let the noise of the day drift away. Let your own breath be the only rhythm now. If this quiet hour brought you some comfort, feel free to come back anytime.
Subscribe to my channel, and if you'd like, leave a small hello in the comments. A reminder that this circle of listeners, scattered across the night, is closer than it feels. The shutters are drawn, the streets are hushed, only stillness remains. So rest. You've wandered long enough among stone walls and straw beds. Good night. We'll meet again.